Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalat wassalam ala rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. After praising Allah and sending blessings on His beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we're honored to be here tonight to talk about the topic fighting prejudice with the prophetic paradigm. I'm honored to be here simply because this is a initiative that's been taken by the leadership of Baitul Mukarram here in Danbury, and I'm very familiar with the leadership here. I've been here before, and I've actually been to this program. There are few things that we can do that are more important than reinforcing who we are as Muslims for ourselves, for our families, for our children. And this is one of the important efforts that we need in this place and at this particular time. As you know, living in the United States can be quite difficult if you don't remain firmly grounded in your deen, because there's so many distractions. I mean, we even pay for the distractions. I wrote up with Brother Sabor and Brother Johnny, and we were talking about how to disconnect from our smartphones and connect to the Quran more often, because these are distractions of this life, and Allah Ta'ala says what means the life of this world is but play and amusement. And we made the point that this play and amusement, we pay for it, right? We pay for the smartphones to try to sell us things. And so I'm thankful to be here, and I'm thankful to be very early here simply because, first of all, I'm not an alim, and so I'm not trying to teach you your deen. I'm trying to make connections between our deen and some of the things that are going on around us, and I think that's important to understand. The other thing is that my background, as was pointed out by the brother who introduced me, is really in comparative religions, that is looking particularly at Christianity and Islam. I do a lot of work on that, and also in African studies, mainly in African American studies. So much of what I'm going to do here tonight is to try to bridge the gap between my understanding of comparative religion, African studies, and my experience in the United States of America. I'd like to say three things about it before I begin my formal presentation. Number one, I was raised in the segregated South, which means that when I was young, I was raised in a system wherein it was illegal for, quote, black people and white people to go to school together. It was illegal for black people and white people to even get married. There's a very famous Supreme Court case, was only decided in 1963, where in the state in where I was raised, the state of Virginia, it was illegal for a, quote, white person and a black person to get married. And this is the famous case, the Loving, L-O-V-I-N-G case, that was only settled then. And that's not so far away. And so I have that experience. The second thing is that, alhamdulillah, I took Shahada in 1979, mashallah, and so I am a revert to Islam. I did not come up in the Islamic family like many of you did, and so that's a very different experience from some of you in the audience. I know there are some people here who are like me who reverted to Islam. The third thing is that since 1980, which is about 37 years, I've been going into the New Haven Correctional Center in New Haven, Connecticut, and talking to people who are mainly reverts of all types, mainly people who either found Islam before they came to jail or became Muslims after they came to jail. So I wanted to give you an idea of my particular background. Again, I'm not an alim, so I'm not here to teach you your deen so much. I'm trying to bridge the gap. And I like being early simply because you have a number of real scholars here. Some of them I know personally, and I respect very highly, that if I say something that's incorrect, they can correct me either today or in the other sessions that come for the weekend. So the topic I've been asked, I asked to talk about was fighting prejudice with the prophetic paradigm. And I chose this topic simply because I think that this country at this particular time, has a serious prejudice problem. And if you watch the news, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a serious problem. People may describe it in different ways, but it's a very serious problem. And I believe, as I'm sure many of you believe, that the solution to this problem is in our deen, and that the role model for the solution to this problem is our beloved Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And so this is how we came up with the topic. I'm going to talk for a little bit. Next slide, please. But I'm going to ask that you, next slide, please. I'm going to ask that at the end that you write down your questions. I forgot to bring my 3x5 cards, but I assume that there are cards, pieces of paper back there for the sisters, and I would ask the brothers to do the same. And that way we can have a discussion afterwards about some of the things I'm going to say here. Okay, so there are three basic things I'd like you to remember. Next slide, please. Next slide. Is someone doing the slide? Yep. Okay, the first thing, prejudice is a test. That's number one. Prejudice is a test. Number two, race isn't real, but racism is. And number three, the prophetic paradigm trumps prejudice. Now, I use the word trumps here. I'm just going to tell you that I don't speak the name of the current President of the United States for many reasons, but one big reason is that I don't think the issue to a large extent is him. The issue is how we react to him and how he got to be where he is. It says more about us than it does about him. So I'm not going to be talking much about him, but I thought it would be interesting to say the prophetic paradigm can be used to trump prejudice. Okay. So before we begin anything, but we should look as Muslims that the first place that we look, because the source of all knowledge is revealed knowledge, is we should look in the Quran. And so what does the Quran say about these things? Next slide, please. The first one is a translation of 29:2, a Yusuf Ali translation, the meaning of which is do people, or men or people, and I think the word actually there is nasu, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, think that they'll be left alone on saying we believe and they will not be tested. I often, the young men I talk to in the jail, I often remind them that once you say La ilaha illallah, Muhammadan Rasulullah, it's time to get real busy in protecting your deen, because shaitan is not going to come after you. We know, as long as you're outside the deen. But once you say this, right? And Allah makes this clear in this particular ayah in the Quran. It says, do you think that you'll be left alone on saying we believe and that you will not be tested? So therefore, you understand that life is but a test. And as we said, prejudice in this case is not a test. If this theme is continued in the next ayah, next slide please. Allah Ta'ala says, the meaning of which we did test those before you, and Allah will certainly know those who are true from those who are false. And so this is a reminder again that life is a test. We tested those who came before our beloved Prophet ﷺ, and Allah will test those who come after. That includes us. And so Allah used these tests as a way of telling who's true and who's false. Next slide, please. So this is an ayah from the Quran, Surah Al-Ma'idah, 548, right? If Allah had so willed, He would have made you a single people, but His plan is to test you in what He hath given you. So strive as in a race in all virtues. The goal of you all is to Allah. It is He that will show you the truth of matters which within you dispute. Now there are other ayats of the Quran, but we'll finish with one more before we launch into our talk. And this is from Surah Al-Baqarah, 148, to each is a goal to which Allah turns him, then strive together as in a race towards all that is good. Wheresoever you are, Allah will bring you together, for Allah hath power over all things. So Allah Ta'ala makes it very clear, right? Makes it very, very clear that life is a test. And this is one of the reasons why we say prejudice is a test, and we'll make this clear in a moment. So what's the social cultural context? Next slide, please. And I want to talk about this in three ways. One is the reality. And this is from a book called The Nature of Prejudice. The reality is that everywhere on earth we find conditions of separateness among groups. People mate, that's a typo, with their own kind. They eat, play, and reside in homogeneous clusters. They visit their own kind, and they prefer to worship together. What's the point here? If you look at the context of people throughout the world, most of us in this room and most people in the world, they rather be with people who are like them, right? They'd rather marry people who are like them. They rather eat the food of people that are like them. And they play, eat, and reside in homogeneous clusters. There's nothing wrong with this in and of itself. There's absolutely nothing wrong with people liking people who are like them. The problem is when this liking becomes problematical, and we'll talk about this in a moment. Right? Next slide, please. The second point is the convenience factor. Much of this cohesion that we find with people is due to nothing more than convenience. There's no need to turn to outgroups for companionship with plenty of people at hand to choose from. Why create for ourselves the trouble of adjusting to new languages, new foods, new cultures, or people of different educational level? It requires less effort to deal with people who have similar presuppositions. So the point is that people stick with their own kind because it's the easiest thing to do. Again, it doesn't make it wrong, but if you look around the world, most people, quote, stick with their own kind. All right, next slide, please. Why do they stick with their own kind? Foreigners are estranged. Now, this is not a quote from political leadership. This is actually from this book. And what's meant by this particular quote is that it takes extra effort to sit with, spend time with people who are different from you. If you go the convenient way, if you go the easy way, you won't learn anything about people who are different from you, because foreigners are estranged. That is, they don't speak the same language. They have a different dialect. And so the reality is very different. I mean, in a country like India, there are many, many languages and many, many dialects, maybe over 20 dialects in that very, very large, very large country. So even inside of countries, you have multiple dialects. And so if we remember this social psychological context, we'll understand more what I'm about to talk about. So back to my three basic points, that prejudice is a test. If we look around, we Muslims know this. Next, please. Because we know that assaults against Muslims in this past year passed the level of what happened in the year that 9/11 happened. 50% of Muslims, adults, say it's become even more difficult to be a Muslim in the United States, 10% of which attribute this to discrimination, racism, and prejudice. 23% of U.S. Muslims adults view discrimination, racism, or prejudice as the most important problem facing American Muslims today. And we know from FBI reports that this situation has only gotten worse in the past couple of years. Next slide, please. It's not only a problem with Muslims. We'll find that gender discrimination in the United States of America is a major problem. That is discrimination against women. for all of the talk about the equality of the sexes in the United States, 42% of working women in the United States say that they have faced discrimination. They report earning less than male counterparts. It's between 70 and 80%, 80 cents on a dollar. That is, a woman in the same job is likely to make, instead of a dollar, make 70 to 80 cents for doing the same job is being passed over for important assignments. By the way, this data is from the Pew Research Center, and it's from last year. This is not old data. So not only are Muslims having a problem in this country, but in the country where they always like to pick on Muslims for gender discrimination, there's a major discrimination problem against women, and we're not even talking about the, quote, Me Too movement that's going on in the general population with sexual harassment and sexual abuse. We're just talking about just working in the workplace. The interesting thing about this, next slide please, is that, I lost my, right? Sorry. I lost my place here, is that Muslims, as a population in the United States, are more likely than Americans overall to say blacks like equal rights in the United States. This is according to the Pew Research Center, September 18, 2017. 67% of Muslims in the United States say that the country needs to continue making changes to give blacks equal rights with whites, a higher percentage than the share of Americans in general who say so, which is 57%. I think this is because of our deen, that we are sort of attuned to discrimination. And so Muslims are more likely to say that there's difficulty around discrimination against black people in this country than the general population. So prejudice, as I said, is a test. The second point, next slide please, is that race isn't real, but racism is. Race isn't real, but racism is. There's a source that I would recommend to you if you want to learn something about how this thing called race happens, is that it's a three-part public broadcast series called Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's called Race, the Power of an Illusion. And along with this three-part series, it has about 50 minutes in each series. You're getting ahead of me. It has about 50 minutes in each series. There is something called 10 things that everybody knows about race, right? 10 things that everybody knows about race. I'm going to talk about 5 of them, and you later on you can look at your smartphone and look up the other 5. Next slide, please. The first point is that what we call race has no basis in genetic, in genes, right? There's no genetic basis. Race is a biological fiction. In addition, skin color really is only skin deep. In other words, there's no difference. You can find people who belong to the same ethnic group, and we can see this in this room, who have different skin colors, right? But oftentimes in this country we talk about blacks and whites, right? But the reality, it has no genetic basis. Skin color is really only skin deep. And the third point is that race justified social inequalities as natural. Much of what we understand about race in the United States is based on our experience with slavery in this country. That is to say that when in 1619, when the first, quote, slaves or people who were forcibly migrated to the United States as black people came to the United States, they came as indentured servants. They were not slaves at that particular time. They could work their way out. And so what happened over time is race justified social inequalities as natural. That is to say that the reason why some people were enslaved and others weren't is because they were less than other people. The next point is that race isn't biological, but racism is still real. Just because you say that race is what we call a social construct doesn't mean that race is not real. Racism is not real. It doesn't have any basis in biology. It has no genetic basis. Skin color is really only skin deep, and it's only a justification for inequalities. And finally, number 5, is colorblindness will not end racism. That is to say that people will say the only way to end racism is to say that everybody's colorblind. But the problem with this is that it wipes out the differences between people, which we need to affirm at different times, and that I don't want people not to see who I am. I just don't want people to discriminate against me because who I am. All right, next slide, please. So on views of race and equality, blacks and whites are worlds apart. About 4 in 10 blacks are doubtful that the United States will ever achieve racial equality. And this again is the Pew Research Center's results of June 27, 2016. Okay. To the next point, the third point, the prophetic paradigm trumps prejudice. Again, the Quranic context is the meaning of which is, "O you believe, stand out firmly for Allah as witnesses to fair dealing, and let not the hatred of others to you make you swerve to wrong and depart from justice. Be just, that is next to piety, and fear Allah, for Allah is well acquainted with all that you do." Now, this is a very important ayah in the Quran, simply because many of us do something what I call the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. What do I mean by this? I mean that there are many people who believe that if my people have been oppressed, then I have the right to strike back at the oppressors or other people by any means necessary. We know this phrase from Malcolm X, by any means necessary. But if you take the Quran as your context, we just cannot do this, right? Because Allah Ta'ala tells us to stand out firmly for Allah as witness to fair dealing, and let not the hatred of others toward you cause you to swerve from justice. Our natural inclination is that when somebody hits us and bloodies our nose, we want to bloody their nose. Our natural inclination, when somebody oppresses my people, we want to turn the paradigm on its head and change it. But the Quran calls on us time and time again to let not the hatred of others to you make you swerve to wrong and depart from justice, to be just. This is the order that is next to piety, and it's fear Allah, for Allah is well acquainted with all that you do. This is a very important context. Now, there is an article that I wrote for the Horizons magazine. Next slide, please. Which is reprinted in, I believe, a newsletter that the Masjid has distributed to the people here, and you can read this later on. So what I'm about to talk about for the next few minutes basically comes from that article, and it focuses on beyond Charlottesville, fighting prejudice with the Quranic prophetic paradigm. So what does Charlottesville have to do with it? Next slide, please. On August 12, 2017, my breath was taken away. Here I was watching videos of a car plowing into a group of people, wherein one person died and 19 people were injured in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was stunning to me. One reason, as I mentioned before, was because I was raised in the state of Virginia, and that Charlottesville is only 120 miles from where I was raised in Roanoke, Virginia, in the segregated school system. And so it made me recall Jim Crow, Virginia. And Jim Crow just means that there were laws, as I said before, that prohibited race mixing between blacks and whites in almost every area. Education, marriage, almost every area. Sports, there was no race mixing between blacks and whites during the Jim Crow era. And so this took me back to that time. What struck me is that the national public discourse on race had changed. So much so that white supremacists and their allies felt shamelessly emboldened. They didn't have to worry about putting on a hood, because what was happening when I was a young kid, people would put on the hood, they would burn crosses to try to intimidate you. Now they put on shirts, they had tiki lamps, And they put on khakis, they put on shirts looking like your average college kid, and they were shouting things like, "You will not replace us," right? And these were white supremacists who felt like they could come out in the open because the national dialogue had changed. Next slide, please. As Muslims in this country, in the wake of what happened in Charlottesville, we have to face two very hard realities. Next slide, please. The first reality is that the Muslim American community has not escaped the malignant social disease of racial prejudice. The first reality is that we, the Muslim American community, has not escaped this malignant social disease of racial prejudice. Where do we see it? We see it in our masajid. There's no problem, in my view, that a masajid has people mainly from one ethnic group. It is problematical if somebody from outside that ethnic group comes into that masjid and he or she does not feel welcome. It is no problem as far as I'm concerned. Remember I talked about convenience before, right? This is what people do. People want to be around people who speak their language. They want to be around people who understand their idioms. That's not problematical as far as I'm concerned. To find a masjid is predominantly African American or predominantly Pakistani, that's not problematical, or predominantly from Tunisia. What's problematical if somebody comes from outside and we don't rise above this kind of prejudice, and we don't make him or her feel welcome. And this is the problem. It even extends to the issue of marriage, right? We see ads in magazines sometimes, like Islamic Horizons, where people are looking for light-skinned mates for their light-skinned sons or their light-skinned daughters. In India and Pakistan, there's a multi-million-dollar bleaching industry where people are trying to get lighter and lighter. And so the reality is that the Muslim American community has not escaped this malignant social disease of racial prejudice. And sometimes people who come here from outside of the United States take on the mores of the United States, right? And sometimes the same ideas of racial prejudice that we have in the United States, people who often immigrate here take on those mores. By the same token, many African Americans take on what I call the post-victimization ethical exemption syndrome. That is to say that they say and do things, against, quote, immigrants. They say things about, quote, immigrants based on their being victimized in the larger sense. And so the first reality that we have to understand is that the Muslim American community has not escaped this malignant social disease of racial prejudice. And that if we were going to be the leaders for humanity, we have to root this out. The second hard reality, next slide please, is that we as Muslim Americans need to face is that we are called upon by the Quran and the life example of our beloved Prophet ﷺ to be leaders in fighting all types of prejudice. If we look at his life example, he stepped to prejudice when he saw it. It involved Bilal, may Allah be pleased with him, who was mistreated because of his heritage. He would step to it immediately. And so therefore, if we say we're following the sunnah of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, this is what we have to do. Right, next slide, please. So we know this because we know the famous hadith about our beloved Prophet ﷺ, that the sermon in which he said famously, "O people, indeed your Lord is one and your Father is one. Indeed there is no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab, nor of a non-Arab over an Arab, nor of a white over a black, nor a black over white, except by taqwa." Next slide, please. With the Quran and the explicit reported works of our beloved Prophet ﷺ, as background, we need to do two things. Number 2, reduce the possibility of more Charlottesvilles. Now, we have a different slide there. Number 3, the prophetic paradigm trumps prejudice. Right. Reduce the possibility of more Charlottesville and help heal the serious racial rifts in a broader American society. Next slide, please. So there are 3 things that I talk about in the article that I'd like to focus on in wrapping up. First of all, we should constantly remind ourselves and others that all humanity is one. Biologists tell us this. Darwinists tell us this. Charles Darwin, the survival of the species, he tells us this. That biologists would tell us, and people who follow Charles Darwin will tell us, that everybody in this room has 2 things in common. Number 1, everybody in this masjid, all the men and the women and the children have 2 things in common. Number 1, that none of your forebears, none of your people who came before you died before they were old enough to mate. Because if they did, you wouldn't be here. You get it? None of the people who came before you died before they were old enough to mate. The second thing that we have in common, and this is shown by biologists, right, is that everybody in this room, biologists argue, has a single ancestor. If you go back further enough, biologists argue, this is biology, not theology, biologists argue that we go back far enough that everybody in this room has a single ancestor. So this is why race is so ridiculous, right? The reality is that if you go back far enough, all of us are descended from a single ancestor. And you know what? Before Charles Darwin, next slide please, our Lord told us this in Surah An-Nisa, and many of us know this better than I. Ya ayyuhan nas, O humanity, reverence your God and Lord who created you from a single person, created of like nature is made, and from the 2 of them scattered countless men and women, and fear Allah through whom you demand your mutual rights, and so on to the end. And so before Charles Darwin came along with this idea of the survival of the species, before the biologists came along with the idea that all human beings, long before this, right, long before this, Charles Darwin is the 19th century, this is a new idea in progressive ideology. Before he came along, our Lord told us this, right? O humanity, Ittaqullah, right? O humanity. Why? Because he created you. What did he create you? He created you from one person, and from this person created his mate, and from the 2 of us, the 2 of them spread countless men and women throughout the earth. And so that's the first point. So we need to remind ourselves at this point, no matter how different we look in this room, right? No matter how different we look in this room, we all are descended from one being, right? And we say this over and over again, but we go and we act otherwise. The second point is that we should get to know people who are apparently different from us, right? Allah Ta'ala, next slide please, tells us in Al-Hujurat, and again this is a famous ayat that's quoted over and over again by the Muslims that we often don't carry out, states that, O humanity, we created, again it's addressed to all humanity. It's not Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, it's not all those you believe, it's to all humanity. We created you from a single pair of a male and female and made you into nations and tribes that you may know each other. That's that test again. Verily the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is the one who is the most righteous of you. Truly Allah is all knowing, all aware. So this is the important point about getting to know people who are different. So again, to recap a little bit, it's not problematical that you have a masjid that's primarily of one ethnic group. It's problematical if people come into your masjid or your Islamic center and feel uncomfortable because they're different. And it's clear from Quran and the Hadith that we are urged to, know one another, right? To get to know one another. And so if the Quran says it, if our beloved Prophet ﷺ what the prophetic community, the community that our beloved Prophet ﷺ surrounded himself with, was what we would call a multicultural community. The community that our beloved Prophet ﷺ, he surrounded himself with, was a multicultural community. And many of you know better than I. And so, with that as background, if we're saying that we're following the Quran, and Allah says that He made us different so we would know each other, not so that we would be a test for be a trial for one another, then it is an obligation for us to get to know people who are apparently different from us. Okay, the third point is, which comes from the first and second. Why? Because the first point is that remind ourselves and others that we are all one, right? The second is that we should get to know people who are different from us. And the third is that we should become civically engaged. There's a short book that I would recommend. As a college professor, I like to recommend books. It's called The Medinian Society at the Time of the Prophet. It's Characteristics and Organization by Akram Dia al-Umari. This book you can get from the International Institute of Islamic Thought. It's a very easy read in English. It was written in Arabic, but it's in English. And if you look at this book, I mean, it's a seerah, right? But it's a very short biography of our beloved Prophet. It reflects a leader who was civically engaged. It reflects a leader who is civically engaged. What do I mean by this? Is that in Medina, where he was born, he was civically engaged. He was engaged in helping the poor and the downtrodden. He was civically engaged in the sense, what I mean by civic engagement, he was involved in the life of the total community by helping people in that community. And also he was known as Al-Amin. Again, you know better than I. He was known as Al-Amin, as trustworthy, as a person who could be trusted to keep a trust. And he's also known as a person who settled conflicts. And we know the famous story of the replacing of the black stone with the Kaaba. And so it clearly reflects a civically engaged model of behavior by our beloved Prophet ﷺ. And the Quranic context, Allah Ta'ala says, the meaning of which, thus we've made of you an ummah justly balanced, that ye might be witnesses over the nations, and a messenger being a witness over you. So what we have here is a situation wherein from the Quran and from the prophetic paradigm, that we're engaged in and pushed to engage in a situation where we're supposed to be the leadership for the entire world. So that's why prejudice in itself is a test for us. Because you cannot be the leadership or witness for all humanity if you're prejudiced against some of humanity. You just can't do it. And what Allah makes it clear is that our beloved Prophet ﷺ is a witness for and against us, and we're supposed to be a witness for all humanity. Next slide, please. So remember, in order to reduce racial prejudice, be a witness for all humanity by 1, constantly reminding ourselves and others that all humanity is one. 2, getting to know people who are apparently different from us. And 3, becoming civically engaged. Okay. I want to close by saying that one of the things I do is that I work with an organization called the Islamic Seminary Foundation, and every year we try to bring together the leadership, imams and chaplains at Yale University to talk about important issues. And I want to give this as an example of the kind of things that we're talking about. And we come from all kinds of backgrounds, and we are a very multicultural group, and we try to tackle issues together. And this is an example of being civically engaged. Next slide, please. And that conference is on March 24th, and it's going to be on Islam, ethics, and the American context, and it's going to be at Yale University. Next slide, please. So always remember the Quranic context. And the beautiful thing about this closing ayah of the Quran for this talk is that if you go to Harvard University, which is one of the top universities in the United States of America, if you go to the Harvard Law School, you'll find that one of the things they try to do at the Harvard Law School is they put examples of justice, quotes that are examples of justice on the walls of Harvard Law School. If you go to Cambridge and you go to the Harvard Law School, this ayah is not important because it's there, but it should help us to understand that what we have is extremely, extremely valuable, that we shouldn't turn our backs on our usul, on our primary text. This is an ayah that many Muslims know and quote all the time. And so people who are not Muslims take a look at this and see that this is a higher form of justice than most of us are used to. It's Surah An-Nisa 4:135, the meaning of which is, O you who believe, be persistently standing firm in justice, witnesses for Allah, even if it be against yourselves, or your parents and your relatives, whether it's for rich or poor. Allah is more worthy of both. So follow not your personal inclination, lest you not be just, and if you distort your testimony or refuse to give it, then indeed Allah is ever with you, well acquainted with all that you do. This is a very, very high standard of justice, right? Stand firm for justice, even, first of all, if it's against yourself or against your parents. Many of us will have a hard time being just with our parents or with the other relatives. And sometimes we will stand on the side of people just because they're rich. And sometimes we'll stand on the side of people just because they're poor. I teach African American history where I work. I often ask my young students whether or not they believe that the slaves, that is the African American slaves, the African slaves, were morally superior to the white people who enslaved them. And they usually say yes. But there's no reason why that we should believe that because somebody's poor, because somebody's oppressed, that they're morally superior. This ayah from the Quran makes this very clear, that we should stand for justice whether they're rich or they're poor, and whether they're, and by extension, whether they're black or white, whether they're part of our group or not. And so we should always remember the Quranic context. Right. Next slide, please. So, all this is what was introduced before. If somebody wants to reach me after this, that's my email address. And if you have questions, sisters can send them up, brothers can write them down. And we thank you for listening. And I just want to remind us that we have a great, great responsibility. We have a beautiful deen we should put into practice, and we should take the role in leadership of fighting not only prejudice, but fighting corruption, fighting poverty, and the things that drag us down as a collective people in this country, as well as us as Muslim Americans. Thank you very much for listening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
There's a question for you.
Here's a question. I'm sure you've been touched. I'm sure that you've been touched by racism. Is there one event that still affects you today, and what precaution do you take to avoid trouble? I'm sure you've been touched by racism. Is there one event that still affects you today? What do you take? I think the racist event that really affects me today is the murder of somebody called Emmett Till, E-M-M-E-T-T, I believe. I'm misspelling his first name, but his last name is Till, T-I-L-L. Emmett Till was a young 14-year-old boy, 1954 or 55, I believe. He went to Mississippi. In the African-American community, oftentimes people will come, send their children from the north to the south because there was a mass migration black people from the South to the North in order to be with their their parents or their relatives in the South. I believe it was in 1955. Young Emmett Till, at the age of 14, he traveled to Mississippi, and he was staying there with his grandfather, and he said something, quote, fresh to a white woman. And Emmett Till, as a result of saying something, quote, fresh to a white woman, he ended up dead the next day. They found his body in the river. Why did this have such an impact on me? Because this is a form of terrorism. I mean, we talk about terrorism a lot.
A little closer.
All right. We talk about terrorism a lot. The reality is that this kind of thing, this kind of lynching and killing of black people for the slightest infraction was a form of terrorism. And it did terrorize me. I mean, it still, you know, we had a magazine called Jet Magazine. It still haunts me today. The fact that this 14-year-old boy was saying, and there's a video called Eyes on the Prize that chronicles this, what happened due to the eyewitnesses. And basically, he said to the woman, quote, "Bye, baby." That's what he said. And it was a white woman, and she went and told her husband and a friend went and got him, and they murdered him. Just for saying something to her. It stunned me, and it's still with me today, that people can murder a 14-year-old boy simply for talking. I mean, there was no allegation that he sexually assaulted anybody. It was just that he said something that was that went out of the racial moral, out of the what was expected racially. And the reason that it impacts me so much is because there's so much talk about terrorism today, but black people during that time were terrorized in that way by lynchings, by night riders, by the Ku Klux Klan, and that's why the Charlottesville was so impactful for me, because it reminded me of that kind of terrorism.
Too many kids making noise. You're going to have to hold the mic closer to your mouth, please.
Okay. I think this is better. This is better?
Yeah.
Okay. Please share with us one defining event in American history that confirmed racism exists. How did that event shape your life? Maybe it's the same thing. But I think if the way to understand racism in America is to understand immigration in America. Now that's great. Why? Because in 1790, the United States Congress passed a law saying that citizenship was only open to free white people. 1790, the United States Congress, one of the first laws. And since then, a lot of people who've immigrated to the United States have been trying to be white. Some Muslims included, right? And there have been famous cases about people coming from the Indian subcontinent in particular who were litigated, who were trying to be white, because whiteness was seen as the, quote, holy grail. Now let's understand, in 1790, Jews weren't white. In 1790, Italians weren't white. In 1790, many of the people they thought of being white were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Catholics weren't white, right? So if you want to understand the history of racism in this country, look at the immigration system. Even today, race plays a big role in how we understand in 2018 the immigration system. So it's not one event, it's how we handle our borders. The other people talk about this today. And so 1790 we passed that law. I believe in the 19th century, early 19th century, we passed something called the Asian Exclusion Act. The Asian Exclusion Act. That wasn't taken off of the books till the Chinese Exclusion Act. Then there was an Asian Exclusion Act. It wasn't until 1965 after the Civil Rights Movement, that we open our doors to people of color to come into this country. So what people are talking about today, keeping people from certain countries out, is not new. This is old news. And so what has happened is that we're going back to where we were before. So what I'm saying is that if you want to understand the history of racism in this country, look at the immigration policy and look at the fact that many people who were not white when they came here, like Italians and Catholics, are now white, which means that what whiteness is has more to do with power, right? And that one event that helped accelerate this whole idea of whiteness is the Civil War and the millions of black people who were released from slavery due to the Civil War. And then you had the Ku Klux Klan, and people wanted to reinforce the idea of whiteness to separate us, black people, from them. All right. My best advice or methodology to fight nationalism in the masjids, right? I used to be the chair of the board of Masjid al-Islam in New Haven, Connecticut. And I'll just tell you what I tried to do to fight nationalism. First of all, I tried to encourage people to be on the board, a multicultural board, like the community of our beloved Prophet, ﷺ. He's surrounded with people from different ethnic backgrounds, right? Salman the Persian, you know better than I, right? That's number one. So you try to get people in leadership. Bilal, right? He was had been a slave, and he was half Abyssinian. I mean, so you try to get people in leadership, right, who represent the diversity of the masjid. That's number one. Number two, when you see people being discriminated against because of prejudice, you step to it. Our beloved Prophet, ﷺ, when people came to him and telling him that people were disrespecting Bilal because of his heritage, he stepped to it, right? And so not only did he step to it, but Abu Bakr, may Allah be pleased with him, he stepped to it when people did not want the son of a slave to lead the Muslim army. And Abu Bakr said, you complained about his father, why, you coming to me complaining about him. And so that's the second thing. The third thing is that when we teach people in the masjid, we should teach them about the problems of prejudice and racism and how our beloved Prophet ﷺ handled it. So those are the three things I would recommend. Make sure that your leadership is diverse. Make sure that when you see it happening, if you're in leadership, you'll step to it, like our beloved Prophet ﷺ did. And third, teach about racism and what it means in this society, in this situation. Right. Jazakallah khairan for your talk. How do we raise children that are not racist? Is it enough just for you not to be racist, or is there more to it? I think that children will emulate their parents, right? And so therefore, if you go out of your way to be around people just because of their piety, just because of their taqwa, that to me that's enough. Because every community I've found that people who are pious and people who love Allah, they come from different ethnic backgrounds. It's not all the Egyptians that love Allah or all the Pakistanis. There are people from different groups. If you role model that, and I want to add, if you present Islam as something to be valued, loved, and followed, right? Valued, loved, and followed, then as opposed to a set of harsh rules that you want to keep your youngsters to follow, you'll be much better. I find it problematical that as I travel the country and listen to the khutbah of people, of the khatibs, is that usually what I hear, and it's not a representative sample of what I hear, but what I hear the khatib talking about is how bad a Muslim we are in the Jama'ah. You shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that. And most of the times what I hear in the khutbah is the negativity that's within our community. Now, there's no problem with pointing out the faults of a community, but what about the sweetness of Islam? What about how Islam, for me, Islam has raised me up. from my background, is Islam. Much of the success, the little bit of success that I have in this world, to me, to a large extent, is because of my deen. I'll give you a quick example. That is to say that where I work, people look up to me. And I'm very much out as a Muslim, and I very much say that my principles come from Islam, even though college professors tend to be atheists and secularists. They just do. But my point is that they often gravitate toward me because they know that I'm going to be fair and just, that I'm going to try to be honest. And so how do you raise a child who's going to be a person who's not going to judge people by their skin color or by their accent or where they come from? Gravitate toward the pious people. Be a person who stays in the masjid yourself. And I would add, make the Quran the basis of their education. The Quran, the basis of their education. I mean, these are obvious things. I'm pretty sure you're going to hear from people more learned than me about this. Another one, and by the way, Emmett Till, the accuser, confessed, right, on his deathbed that she lied. She admitted that Emmett Till never made any advances towards her. I would recommend that you, I saw this story, but I would recommend that you, the person who wrote this, you go Google Eyes on the Prize, segment 1, and there was an eyewitness, his cousin. His cousin talked about what he saw and heard that day. And so I honestly, I don't know what the point of the story about her confessing on her deathbed. Without her, quote, confession, it was clear that a grave injustice had been done. Even if he said what he said, whether he said it or not, it was a grave injustice. His cousin said, who was there, he said, bye, baby, right? And she might, I don't know what the confession meant. So the point is that no matter what the story was, a grave injustice was done. Okay, next one. Is there a comparison to what is going on now and during civil rights movement? I think the big difference between what's going on now and the civil rights movement, in my view, is that the people of faith that need to step up are not stepping up. The person, I'm teaching a course on Martin Luther King Jr. This spring. His Aqidah is not ours. We don't believe what he believes. But one thing about Martin Luther King Jr., if you study his speeches and you study his life, he walked his talk. He wasn't a perfect person. The FBI spied on him and all of that. But he walked his talk. He believed, if you read his readings, he believed that you could not be a Christian. You could not be a Christian and not care about other people all around the world. You could not be a Christian without fighting for justice for people around the world. Muslims should believe that we cannot be a Muslim unless we're in the forefront for justice for all. There are people who are trying to do this. Omar Suleiman, who's a friend and associate that many of you know, he's trying to do this in Dallas, Texas. He's very much involved on the ground. But far too many of us think that Islam is something for Friday or for Hanukkah, right? No, the reality is that we have a responsibility to the whole world. So I think the big difference is that the people of faith, and I mean primarily the Muslims, haven't stepped up in a way that I believe we should on behalf. If you understand King, you'll understand, if you read King closely, you'll understand that he used the fight for justice for African Americans to raise the Christian ideology. He was not preaching about race. He was preaching about what it meant to be a Christian. I believe that Muslims can do the same for this country. That is, to use the fight for Muslims right now, because people are really after us through immigration and other ways, as a way to fight for social justice for everybody. So that's the difference. I think we need to step up. We need to defend the Muslims, but we need to defend anybody who's being dealt with unjustly. I think the Quran and the Hadith are very clear on this. Let's see. Next one. how can we deal with racial discrimination in our masjid? I think I talked a little bit about this. If you can't, honestly, I'll be honest about this. If you can't get people to deal with it, then I don't have any problem with going to another masjid. That's me. I say, oh no, you shouldn't be divided. But the reality is that if you're in a situation where people are discriminating against your people simply because they're who they are, the problem is that you run the risk of running people and your family away from Islam. So you want to be in a place where you feel comfortable. So I would argue that if you can't get leadership's attention, you should go somewhere else where you can. Next one is, how do we talk to kids about Trump's behavior? Kids are 4 to 10 years old. All right, I'll leave that one to last, and this is next to the last one. All right, is it okay for black people to use the N-word? If so, why? Oh, that's too hot, man. It's all right. I don't use the N-word because it's a derogatory term that was applied to black people. I understand the context in which people use the N-word. Black people use the N-word as a term of endearment. That's my N, right? And so much so that it's been stolen by white people. Young white college students say, that's my N. So to me, this is not a cultural behavior that I think that black people should promote. That's just me. I mean, I'm not going to jump anybody for it. So generally, I think not, because I think that we want to be the best. And if we're African American and Muslim, we want to be the best of the best. And so I don't think it bespeaks the best, because usually, again, it comes from a very negative place in our history, and it's a very hateful name that people have been called. And I understand. Often the same people who use it within their group are upset when white people use it. So I say, let's settle this and not have anybody use it. All right, so Trump. How do you talk to your children about Trump? Well, why don't I talk about how do you talk to your children about Barack Hussein Obama? And I think that'll give you an idea of what I think about talking about Trump. I think that civic engagement is something that starts fairly young, but I think to a certain extent that young people between 4 and 10 years old are not going to understand politics. I mean, politics is very complex. I gave a khutbah at Yale University a few weeks ago, and I made the point that people are very upset about what the current president is doing. I said I wouldn't say his name too much, but I wanted to remind people of a couple of things about the former President Barack Hussein Obama. By the way, I think that in terms of family values for this country, he was a paragon of family values, and Muslims are about family values. If you look about how he treated his family, even his family, his Muslim family back in Kenya, go look it up, mashallah. But when it came to his politics, I felt that it fell short. He didn't get rid of extraordinary renditions, for instance, where taking people secretly away to other countries and torturing them. He was the first president who felt like it was okay to assassinate American citizens. He was the very first president, and he gave away 38, I think it was $billion to Israel just before he left office. I mean, I don't want to get into the thing about Israel, except for the point that, I mean, at a time when we were having serious financial difficulties, he signed a 10-year agreement with Israel to give them $38 billion. Why am I saying all of this? Is that politics is a very complex business, right? And so I just don't think that I would be talking to 4 to 10-year-olds about Barack Obama and what he did and did not do, except in a sense where he reinforces Islamic values. So it goes for the current president, right? The reality is that, yeah, they see him. Well, this goes to another issue, of course, is how much screen time our youngsters have, right? One of the conversations that I had with Brother Sabor and Brother Johnny driving up here, I have a love-hate relationship with my smartphone, and I'm trying to get a divorce and keep the children, right? Because the reality is that the internet isn't free, right? It's about money. It's about trying to sell you stuff, and much of the values that we see on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all of this are not Islamic values. What does this have to do with the current president? Is that this is a media president, right? That he's gonna be in the news all the time. I don't watch news as much as I used to personally at my age, simply for two reasons. Number one, it hurts my heart to hear some of the things that he says about people in general, not just about Muslims. And number two, I don't want to be in a situation where I have animus toward other human beings, because I believe that what's going on has more to do with our country than it does with one person. So I would not teach first of all, I wouldn't expose 4 to 10-year-olds to a lot about Donald Trump. I wouldn't let them watch a lot of this stuff, because a lot of stuff, they're just not going to get it and just not going to understand it. I would focus on Islamic values that have to do with being non-racist, would have to do with being fair and just. That's how I would handle that situation. I thank you very much for your listening to me. I pray Allah Ta'ala that this pathway to Jannah is a benefit to all of you. I pray that I've said something today that's beneficial. Any mistakes I made are mine. Any benefit you get come from my Lord. I bear witness that if you try to follow, not be perfect yet, but you try to follow the Quran and the Sunnah, you'll be successful in this life and in hereafter. May Allah Ta'ala have mercy on us. May He join us together on the day when there's no shade. May it make us amongst those who remind all of us that humanity is one. May it make us amongst those who remind all of us that we need to stand up for justice. May He save us all from the hellfire. Save us all from the hellfire. Save us all from the hellfire. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.